He told me to stand still, and I did, because standing still was the only thing I had ever been praised for. I remember the light in my mother's kitchen that morning, thin and gray through the curtain, and the smell of the wood stove, and the way my good dress felt too tight across the shoulders, because I had sewn it myself in a hurry the week before. I stood in the middle of the floor with my hands folded in front of me, the way I had been taught since I was small, and he walked around me once, slow, and then again, slower, not touching, just looking, at my hands first, then my wrists, then the way I held my shoulders, whether I stood straight or bent, whether my chin was up or down. Nobody said a word. My mother stood by the stove with a dish towel in her hands that she was not using for anything. His mother stood by the door with her arms crossed over her apron. And I stood in the middle of all of it, in the one dress I owned that did not have a stain on it, and I understood, somewhere underneath my ribs, that this was not a visit. This was an inspection. And I was the only person in that kitchen who did not know its rules. Before I tell you what he was looking for, and what it meant when he finally gave a small nod, like a man closing a deal on a horse, let me tell you who I am. My name is Anna Miller. I'm 29 now. I grew up Old Order Amish, in a small, strict settlement where a girl's worth was measured the way you measure a length of good rope, by how much weight it could carry without breaking, and how quiet it stayed while it did. This is Anna's Ordnung Stories, the channel where I finally say the things I was raised to swallow. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who lived inside it, not someone who only drove past it in a tour van, subscribe, and tap that like button, and in the comments, tell me something. Were you ever inspected, in any way, before someone agreed to keep you? I read every comment. I answer more than people expect. Now let me explain the morning in that kitchen, because to understand it, you have to understand something the English never quite believe when I tell them. In my community, a girl was not only chosen, she was examined. Not with paperwork. Not with anything written down anywhere the bishop could point to. But before a young man's family agreed to a marriage, there was a visit, a quiet one. A visit that looked, to anyone driving past on the road, like nothing more than a boy and his mother stopping by to be neighborly. But it was never neighborly. It was assessment. It was the part of courtship nobody spoke of at the singings, the part that happened after a boy had already decided he wanted you, and before his family had decided you were allowed to be wanted. I was 19. My courtship with Eli had been short, the way they nearly all were. Buggy rides home from the singing, a few Sunday evenings on the porch with my father pretending not to watch through the window. And then, one Tuesday in early spring, his mother sent word that she and Eli would be coming by on Thursday, and my own mother's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went still. Not happy, not unhappy, just still, the way a face goes when it is bracing. She did not explain what was coming. She only told me to wear the blue dress, the one without the mended seam, and to keep my sleeves down past my wrists, and to say as little as I could manage. I asked her why. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked a question with no safe answer, and she said, "You will understand Thursday." And that was the end of it. In our house, when a mother said, "You will understand," you did not ask again. Asking again was its own kind of failure. Thursday came, and I stood in that kitchen, and Eli walked around me, and I felt his eyes move across parts of me I did not know were being graded. He looked at my hands first. Not the fingers, not the shape of them, but the palms, turned up, calluses across the base where the washboard and the hoe and the harness lines had worn me since I was 7 years old. Soft hands in our world were not admired. Soft hands meant a girl had been spared work, and a girl who had been spared work was a girl who had not yet learned to be useful. and usefulness was the whole floor that everything else in a marriage was built on. He looked at my wrists next, the width of them, whether they looked strong enough to carry 2 full buckets up from the spring without setting them down to rest. He looked at my shoulders, whether I stood with them back or let them curl forward, the way a tired girl's shoulders curl. Posture, in our world, was read as character. A girl who stood straight was a girl who had not been broken by laziness, or, worse, by pride that made her slouch in false humility to be noticed for it. He looked at my skin, briefly, at my face, not for beauty, I understood even then, but for color, for whether I looked pale or sickly, for whether my eyes looked clear or tired in a way that might mean I was not strong enough for what a farm and a house full of children would ask of a body over 30 years. And the whole time, I stood there in silence, because I had been taught since before I could remember that a girl who spoke during an important moment between families was a girl announcing her own pride. I wanted so badly to ask a single question, just one. I wanted to ask what exactly he was checking for, and whether I had passed anything yet, and whether this was normal, because nothing in me believed, standing there, that this was normal, even though every woman I had ever known had stood in some version of that same kitchen once in her life, and never once spoken of it afterward. But I had been trained too well for the question to ever reach my mouth. The training did not feel like training. It felt like goodness. I had been taught that a quiet girl was a godly girl, that a girl who held her tongue in the presence of her elders and her intended was showing exactly the kind of Gelassenheit a wife would need for the rest of her life, the yielding, the giving up of her own will before anyone had even asked her to give up anything specific yet. So, I practiced yielding before I was even asked to yield. I practiced it in that kitchen with my hands folded and my chin down and my mouth sealed, because I believed, the way I believed the sun would rise, that my silence was the proof of my worth. Nobody in that community would have called it an inspection if you had used that word out loud. They would have called it wisdom. They would have called it preparation, the way you check a mare's teeth and legs before a long season of work, not out of cruelty, but out of care, out of responsibility, because a family was entrusting their son to a woman for the rest of his life, and a family owed it to him to look closely before that trust was given. They would have called it Ordnung, the order of things, the way things had always been done, back through his father's mother and her mother before that, an unbroken line of kitchens and standing girls and folded hands, so old that nobody left alive could tell you when it started or why, only that it had always been this way, and always being this way was its own kind of proof that it was right. But what I did not know, standing there at 19 with my palms turned upward for a boy I barely knew to study like a length of good rope, was that he had already been told exactly what to look for. His mother had told him. Her mother had told her. There was a whole language passed down mother to son, quietly, at kitchen tables just like this one, about which signs in a girl meant strength and which meant weakness, which posture meant obedience and which meant a hidden stubbornness that would cause trouble later. He was not improvising that morning. He was executing a checklist he had been handed his whole life without ever once calling it a checklist. And I was the only person in the room who did not know the questions being asked of me, because nobody had ever thought it was necessary to tell the girl what she was being tested for. The test worked better if she did not know it was a test. And here is the part that took me 10 years and a great deal of quiet grief to understand fully. The inspection was never only about my hands. It was never only about my wrists or my shoulders or the color in my face. The real thing being tested, underneath all of it, was whether I would stay silent while I was studied, whether I would fold my hands and lower my eyes and let a boy and 2 mothers discuss my body and my usefulness in the third person, in front of me, as though I were not fully present in the room. A girl who protested, even gently, even just by asking what he was looking for, would have been marked as something far worse than weak hands. She would have been marked as proud, as difficult, as a girl who would speak up later, in the marriage itself, when a husband needed a wife who would not. My silence that morning was not a side effect of the inspection. My silence was the inspection. The hands and the wrists and the posture were only the visible part, the part that could be discussed at the frolics afterward in careful, coded language. The real question, the one nobody ever wrote down anywhere, was simpler and colder than any of that. Will she stand there and let this happen to her without a single word? Because if she will do that at 19, in her mother's kitchen, in front of everyone, then she will do it for the next 50 years, in every kitchen after this one, in every silence a marriage asks of her. I passed. Eli gave that small nod I told you about, the one like closing a deal on a horse, and his mother's shoulders came down from wherever they had been held up near her ears, and my mother finally set down the dish towel she had been holding without using, and something in the room exhaled all at once, and nobody explained anything to me. We were married that November. I think about that girl now, the one standing in the gray light with her hands turned up and her mouth sealed, and I feel a grief for her that does not have a bottom to it. Not because anyone struck her, not because anyone raised a voice to her. Nobody needed to. She had already agreed, before she ever understood what she was agreeing to let her own worth be decided by people speaking about her while she stood close enough to hear every word, and far enough away to be permitted no reply. I understand now what I could not understand then, standing in that kitchen at 19. Obedience and holiness are not the same thing, no matter how completely they were folded together in front of me. A girl can be quiet because she is at peace, or a girl can be quiet because she has been taught so early and so thoroughly that her voice is a danger to be managed. Nobody in that kitchen ever told me the difference, because the whole arrangement depended on my never learning it. I was told this was normal. It wasn't. If you grew up somewhere, plain or otherwise, where staying silent while you were judged was called good manners, called respect, called being a good girl, I want you to hear me say this clearly. That silence was never proof of your goodness. It was only proof that someone had succeeded in teaching you not to ask what you were worth. Tell me in the comments, honestly, were you ever taught that staying silent while someone decided something about you made you good? I want to hear it, whatever it is. I read every single one of them, and I will not look away from what you tell me. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.